Hi, everybody. I know it's been a minute. I've been working really hard. I'm the owner of a business, and so things got really crazy, no staff, and so I had to do all the work myself. But I have been missing you so much, and I want to welcome you to another great episode of Royal Black and Elite. I'm Lady Trinette Wilson, and I am associate historian and author, best-selling author now. Thank you all for liking, sharing, subscribing. Our channel continues to grow, so I promise to be a little bit more consistent, trying to do at least once a week. And I'm starting to get a little bit of help, getting ready to do my conference where I'll meet all my etiquette sisters from across the world. So let's get ready for today's episode. Growing up on the Gulf, we ate oysters and we ate them all the time. I absolutely love seafood. And so that's what makes today's story so interesting because we have an adventurer of sorts who grew a business to become the New York king of oysters. His name was Thomas Dowling. In the 1800s, oysters were everywhere. They were well loved, they were eaten all the time. They were really known more as a common food back then. But it was a man, this Thomas Downing, who really made it a big deal all over the world. Now, as I researched him, I couldn't find his mother and father's names, but his records do show that he was born in Chincoteague Island, Virginia, to enslaved parents. Now, at some point, the man who owned them, Sea Captain John Downing, set them free. He was actually convicted by the Methodist Church's belief that it was not Christian or as a good believer in God, to own slaves. Fancy that. So he set them free and he paid them to oversee a kind of like a school church that he had, and it was called the Methodist Meeting House. And here's an example of what a meeting house would look like from those days. And so he put them over that house, and they were able to, because of their skills of being able to sell their oysters, save money, and they really did well. Now, the Dowlings were excellent at their work, and eventually they made enough money to purchase a home. And so back in the 18 and late 1800s, that's something really special. They earned extra money by gathering and selling oysters. And that's really where Thomas's, I guess, his wonderful career really began in the oyster business. They also did other oysters and seafoods, fish and clams as well. And as you see here, oystering was a big deal back then. And that's the way they really they earned their money. Now, this story again is close to my heart because we had a family of shippers and we sold shrimp and seafood on the side of the road when my parents grew up as well. So, this was a really interesting story. Now, Thomas's family's close proximity to wealthy whites led to Thomas being well educated. He was even tutored by the future governor of Virginia, Henry A. Wise, and he was the governor from 1861 to 1865. This happened to be the same governor who unalived John Brown after John Brown's raid, by the way. So even though he educated Thomas when he was young, clearly his sentiments had changed by the time he was an adult and became governor. So I thought that was an interesting fact, something for you all to know. But let's get back to the real story. Mr. Thomas. So Thomas and his family, they were doing well in Virginia, but by the time Thomas was around 21, he was ready to spread his wings and move beyond the state. And so during the War of 1812, Thomas joined the army and he followed it to Philadelphia. Now, when they say joined, it didn't wasn't really clear if he actually joined the military or he kind of joined them and followed them. So I'm going to say take it that he just followed them because he wasn't. It doesn't say anything about his military career, but it does say this is where he met his wife, Rebecca West. Now, together, they had five children. One of his sons, George, he became very famous for being a civil rights leader. His father, Thomas, we'll get into some of that also as we talk, but Thomas was also really big into civil rights. And he had three sons altogether. It was George, there was Thomas, Henry and Peter, excuse me, four sons, and then one daughter. Her name was Jane, but she passed away when she was still young. So they had a beautiful family. But to take care of his family, he was a valet and he had also continued digging for oysters. Now, digging for oysters was some dirty business back then. Now they made him wealthy, but it was painstaking work. And he was getting older and he was a business minded man. And so he decided to open up his first oyster bar. Now, back then in the 1800s, oyster bars were in the cellars of buildings. And they were a place of communal eating where, like everybody ate. And they were actually known as dives. So dives aren't very nice. But he really changed how people thought about oyster bars because he took it to the next level. It was a good business, but he was still ready to grow. So in 1820, he and his family relocated to New York City, where he sold oysters on the street. So he was kind of back to doing what he was doing when he was in Philadelphia when he first got there. He was fishing and going in early and getting the best oysters. So people began to know him for being the one who had the best oysters. So he kept building his reputation and catering to rich, white, and wealthy patrons. And so in 1825, he saved enough money to purchase now his second um, oyster house, and it was called the Thomas Downing Oyster House. Now he decked the place out using the most finest of linen, fancy silverware, chandeliers, and fancy decor. I mean, his oyster house was known as being the best in the business. It was located at 5 Broad Street, and it was known as an upscale oyster house. In fact, so much so, families could go, which means women could go into the oyster house. Now, back in the day, that wasn't the case because most of the time, an oyster house, the only women who were allowed in there were women of the night. And so, for a family to be able to go into an oyster house and eat with her family was a big deal back then. The Union Oyster House in Boston is known as the first oyster house, but really Thomas Downing's was. And let me tell you, the food that he served was lavish. He would serve things like stuffed chicken with oysters. He did scalloped oysters, and even oyster pie. So I know all that sounds wonderful to me if you like seafood, maybe not so much to others. But he was very innovative because he even jarred his oysters and he sold them across the country. Can you imagine mail order oysters back in the 1820s? You even would have to know how to preserve something like that during that time. So this was a very intelligent man. And by 1835, he had grown to a point that he could get a bigger building, and he moved to 3 and 7 Broad Street. I mentioned how upscale he was, and so it said that he mailed some oysters to Queen Victoria. He fed Charles Dickinson at one of the biggest balls that was hosted in New York at that time. Now it's rumored that Charles said he didn't like um, the oysters, and unfortunately, Charles was in a duel with Andrew Jackson, so we all know kind of what happened with that. Um, but Mr. Downing bought a beautiful home for his family, and this is a picture of that. And did you know some of his food is still being served today? Yes, you can actually try some at the National Museum of History and Culture. His oyster stew recipe is still being served there today. But one of the most important things that he did during his time was that his restaurant was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Can you believe that? I mean, to the day he died, he stayed active in civil rights matters. Education was really important for him too. So he's credited with funding and opening up 3 schools for Black students there in New York. So this man gave his life not only in business but for his community. And I was just honored to bring his story today. Such an interesting story. Here's a marker that they made to him, the Oyster King, who passed away at the age of 75 on April the 10th, 1866. What a great story. I really enjoyed this one. Again, because I love seafood. But also to see a man build a business during that time was really special. Listen, I want to thank you all for rocking with me. I can't thank you enough. Listen, share, like, subscribe, and I'll keep coming each week giving you some great background and history about African Americans throughout time. I really appreciate you, and I hope you enjoyed another great episode of Royal Black and Elite.